Good morning and welcome to the VIP seat. It's September 12th, and today's top stories include how Canadian pilots are looking for pay parity with their U.S. counterparts. And in August, we continue to see a decline in charter flights. Your hosts today include Jessie and our co host, Shaan Banji. So buckle up, sit back, and let's take off. All right, Shaan. So Atlantic Aviation, who's been operating the Aspen airport since 2006, they are almost in the home stretch of winning a new 30-year lease term at the airport. But what's interesting about the deal is that it used to be the county got about $1.2 million from the FBO annually. And in this deal, they've had to give up a lot more. And it looks like the first year is going to be $19 million in revenue. That's a 10x on what the county used to be making. So I'm expecting some higher landing fees in our future.
100%, man. Do I wish I was part of that deal? Jeez. I would love to be counselors of that deal anytime.
I mean, it's crazy. Well, they do have to give them $150 million in capital improvements. So there is some capital outlay as well.
And what are your thoughts? What do you think, coming back to the negotiation table and getting to that kind of number? I mean, what gives? What are they doing? Where's the hidden diamonds,
Well, I think, for someone like Atlantic, they've got over 100 locations already. I mean, Aspen is one of the jewels, right? When it comes to private flying, especially at certain times of year, that's where everybody's going. So I don't know if it's maybe a footprint thing to be there. Maybe the margins are just that great when you're the only field at Aspen Airport in a limited season. I mean, I don't know what the landing fees there are anymore, but I know when we used to have phenoms going in there, I mean, it wasn't unusual to spend a few $100s just in one fee. So
Yeah, I find it interesting because, in up north here in Canada, we typically have airport authorities that regulate the airport and the space and the lands around it. So, you're always subject to the issue of regulatory pushback, right? When you're trying to make any sort of changes, right? Whether it be leasehold improvements or whether it be, I want to make a new hangar on this side, right? Or I want to lengthen the runway, anything really becomes a point of contention. And, that's why things take so long to develop out here. And, typically from the north looking to the south, I find, the US is just, you have so many more airports, there's so much more capability. And so I find it funny to see something like this where effectively the tenant, who's it sounds like they're already a tenant there, and they're trying to renegotiate something where they're in a place where they feel that they have to make it so incredibly lucrative, right? The authority there seems it's probably that, right? It's probably the location is incredibly lucrative, so they know the revenue is there. So it's just a matter now of really, sounds like, who gets the biggest piece of the pie, and that's a really tough negotiation.
well, and they're ramping things up over the 30-year term. It's going from 19 to 44 million, which I guess maybe over a 30-year term doesn't really outpace inflation. I haven't done the math on that. But I wonder if they're going to be adding more potential revenue streams, say more hangarage. I don't think there's a lot of space left at that field. But yeah, I certainly would expect more ramp fees, more sitting fees, more everything in the future, probably.
Well, I mean, it begs the question, what is the primary revenue source of an FBO? I would venture fuel.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would say second on the list would probably be ancillary fees, right?
Mm-hmm.
So related typically to real estate, right? So hangarage fees, ramp fees, like you mentioned, landing fees, those are the only other revenue grabs. But, what's that split? I'd be curious to know what it is, because I think it differs from geography to geography.
Yeah, and Aspen in particular would be unique because a lot of airplanes need to come in light or leave light just because of the high altitude restrictions. So, I wonder if that's a pro or a con. Like, do you end up taking more fuel because you had to go in light, or you're just taking a little bit going out too? It'd be interesting to analyze.
Yeah, well, that becomes challenging too, right? Because when you're at a high altitude, nobody's coming into tanker, right?
No.
They're looking at optimal fuel. So, it's like an extreme case of this would be like Denver, right? That insanely long runway at high altitude, right? I mean, it's probably, I don't know how they're doing business out there when it comes to fuel. So maybe there's certain crazy handling fees or something.
Yep. Well, good for the local county. I hope the residents don't complain too much about the airplane noise because they're about to get a little bit richer.
I guess good luck to them. And I'm everybody who's ever worked in aviation knows about Eagle and Aspen, and those are the key airports, and the big fractional providers go in there all the time. Those hairy approaches. So we know that they're we know the demands there, so it makes sense that this is there's some point of contention.
So this story is full of puns if you can come up with them. I don't even know which one to start with. So I think it's a great example of how a lot of people look at private aviation and they say, oh, it's for the celebrities and the politicians and all these fancy people. But last week in Scotland, there was a very important helicopter mission that was carrying 500 pounds of human waste from a nature reserve in Scotland. How about that situation?
Did you just drop a pun there? That was good. I wasn't expecting that one. I mean, here is a perfect example of the incredible utility of general aviation, right? I mean, this is a remote location in Scotland. It is a place where you can't even take a fixed wing airplane, right? There is no airstrip. And, they're trying to keep the land and preserve the land in the way that it should be. Now, could they have just dug a massive hole and put like a porta potty there? I guess so, right? I'm no agriculture expert, but I think that might wreck some of the vegetation that lives around there, and maybe some of the ecosystems, the habitats. So, I mean, what is the other options, right? Other than, taking a brand new eVTOL and having someone, pull it out. Too heavy, by the way. Don't get me started about eVTOL and electric. But this is the only way, vertical flight, right? And you got to
Yeah.
get a helicopter in there, and they got to just get it out there. So it's an incredible example of how our industry does some incredible things, beyond the typically touted ones, right? Which is medevac and organ transplant, some things that you're obviously intimately familiar with. uh, there's a lot of utility from the industry, and we just have to do, I think, I wouldn't say, actually, no, I'm going to say it. We do a poor job of representing our industry and how the utility that it brings. And the reason why is because some of the digital, at least from my understanding, some of the digital media channels that people advertise in, they tend to get stuck with, the Google PPC keywords of luxury and,
Private
this is
executive.
so private executive. Like, how many companies do you know that use that same language, that same terminology? And because of this overuse of what I would argue is probably only maybe 20% of our industry, if not less, it's now become perceptively as though that is our entire industry. And so we need to kind of take that back, and we need to figure out a way to properly represent our industry. And that's no easy task.
No, and look, I've had that experience personally. I ran a charter operation that was mostly smaller aircraft, light jets. We're talking carrying generally 3 to 4 people. We didn't fly a lot of celebrities. A lot more of our work was utilitarian. It was people whose names you wouldn't know, but they had to get to their meetings. They had to get, to their families after a meeting. Every now and then, again, we would get a celebrity on a light jet, and let me just tell you, when Matthew McConaughey's name came up, I just wanted to go as a flight attendant. Man, just one flight. We only got him for one flight, but I still think about it to this day.
Yeah, well, I mean, I bet we all have our list of people we wish we could meet when we're working in this industry, right? But yeah, no, I mean, the question with that becomes, where do you start, right, in terms of changing the people's perception of this industry? Is it something that's here to stay? Is it just something that we're going to be battling till the end of time, or is there really going to be an inflection point where I think you almost have to really, because of this industry is such a fragmented industry. When you're trying to make a large change, it's very difficult, right? You kind of have to, it's like herding cats. You got to corral everybody together to be able
Yeah.
to make any sort of, impactful change. So it's difficult. Does anybody want to do it? Probably not. And so the incentives aren't in line, and maybe that's why things aren't changing. But I think just talking about it, right?
Yeah.
And, putting poop utility on display is a great way of maybe a great provocative way of saying, hey, by the way, we move poop too,
Yeah. We do all of it.
right?
It's like, well, and two, in addition to the poop critical mission they were completing, they were also helping restore peatlands around there. It's interesting, as I didn't realize this in Scotland, and I'm gonna murder the name of this, but it's called a bothy or boothie, bathy. I don't know. But apparently there's
Wow.
cottages all over Scotland that people can just stay in for free if you're hiking the Scottish Highlands and enjoying nature. So it's very cool. I think that these things exist in the first place, and that they go send helicopters to clean them up. That's pretty fun. Oh, and I did have to convert kilograms to pounds because I had no idea what 20 kilos was, and I needed a little Google help there. So I'm sure you would have already known.
2.2. We, as Canadians, we grow up and we know it's 2.2. That's how you convert. We just know. We say it in kilograms and they're like, oh, you're American? Oh, times 2.2.
Got it.
And then we usually have to
Pretty.
do the math for them because, okay, I'm not going to go there.
I like that. So you guys are like calculators and converters. Great. Well, you were talking about global uses of aircraft, and I actually think that's a really good segue to our next story. So Argus data, they come out every month with reports on charter activity and what's going on, in terms of flight activity in the market. Global traffic is increasing, but unfortunately, we continue to see declines in North America and in Europe, mostly in the charter 135 space, as well as 91. The biggest loss over the last month was large cabin jets, which were doing 9.3% less from over a year ago. And I started digging into the numbers here, and we really haven't seen any year over year growth in the charter industry since May of 2022.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really wondering, when is this going to turn around? How long can this kind of keep dipping?
So it's interesting, right? What I found really interesting about that is, we know here in North America that we're in a bit of a decline, right? But it's really interesting to see beyond North America and Europe, right? Which typically you would say is a fairly good representation of business aviation worldwide, right? I think generally it's about 70% of business aviation happens to be in the United States, right? Not even North America, just the United States alone. And, on the fringe, I think, are other countries, but I think like Western Europe or Europe in total, I think is something like 20%, give or take. But you look at this and you say, okay, well, North America overall and Europe have both declined, but the rest of the world, what's the rest of the world? I would love to know which countries are we talking about and what's the distribution, right? Is that whatever that percentage was? I think it was like 37% of the
Yeah.
remainder is up significantly. I don't know. I wish we had Richard Coe, who's the founder of Wings, on here because he would know exactly and he would tell you like data by data, bit by data bit. So
Oh yeah.
there you go.
Well,
There's
and
your
you
next
have
guest. Richard, if you're listening, you got to come talk to Jessie and dispel all this stuff for us. We
we
need your
need
data, my friend.
a data show. Well, and I wonder too. I mean, look, those are obviously going to be emerging growth locations for private aviation. We're talking about Asia, China, India, those. And when you look percentage wise, comparatively to the US and European market, they're so small that, yeah, those gains can appear, in a much more skewed manner potentially.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, definitely Wings or any of the Argus guys, please let me know if you want to be on the show, because you guys are great at what you do. But
Well, Wings
fractional.
and JetNet are friends now, right? So
Oh
bring
yeah.
them all in together. Get Rolly and get Richard, and I think that those two alone will provide such an incredible insight. I mean, this crazy fragmented industry, it's very difficult, and they do a great job of pulling from different data sets and being able to compile that together to put some sort of narrative together.
Yeah. And it's nice too that a lot of these companies are providing some free data, so the small operators can go like, okay, it's not just me. Like I'm, the all light jets right now are kind of, having a crunch, or, this size cabin. I know that when we were growing, it was really nice to be able to look at some of the risk reports and just kind of benchmark ourselves against everybody else. But I will say, fractional is actually doing great. I mean, they've grown by almost double digits every single month over the last year, but just goes to show you, their airplane orders are coming in, their agreements are locked up, and that's probably having a pretty negative effect on the charter companies at this point.
You know what's crazy about that, Jesse, is I feel like the whole industry is backwards. I've never understood why rationally, right? I mean, forget about everything else. Let's just talk pure logic, pure rationality here. Why should fractional be the one to enjoy such tremendous growth in our space when ad hoc charter is not only cheaper, right? I mean, depending, right? But as a general rule, it's typically cheaper,
Mm-hmm.
and you have the flexibility of different aircraft types, potentially different operators, right? Rationally, if I have the choice and I want to take a trip somewhere, assuming that there is a way to do that really easily, right? We'll leave that alone for a second, but let's say there's a really great, easy way to go and be able to book, ad hoc on a 135 on a plane that's going to be suited for the mission that I need to do. It's safe, everything's vetted, everything's okay, versus a fractional, right? Where I've basically, it's like a timeshare. You go on vacation in the South, and then, someone comes up to you and says, hey, pay me this much money, lump sum, and then you'll get, this is effectively what the fractional program is, right? There's
Yeah.
no difference. And when you start to really get into the detail of the contract, you're looking at, okay, well, peak days, you're actually going to get charged more. There's certain blackout days, and when you start to put the 365 days of the calendar together, you're like, wait a minute, this is like less than 50% of what was advertised is what I'm getting. But
Right.
it's no longer a problem for those customers because the alternates seem to be really sparse. And I think, as I talk about it, I think the problem is if I'm sitting here and I say tomorrow I want to go from X to Y and I try to access the ad hoc charter market, there's no single source to do that. There
It's
isn't
tough.
a way.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly, it's fragmented and it's hard. But at the same time, for 135s and 704s up here and the equivalents around the world, what's the incentive for them to be able to? I mean, they have an incentive to market themselves, but why would they want to be on the same level playing field with another operator, if you know what I
Well,
mean?
I think you brought up fragmented, and that's probably where a lot of this comes from. There's still a lot of small aircraft operations out there, and they don't answer their phone after 5 o'clock at night. So
Big
from a
problem.
customer service perspective, if I'm spending that much money on something, like you better pick up the phone when I call. Some people have had that experience. Also, too, a lot of the charter airplanes that are out there, they're still owned by someone. So the dreaded owner approval
Yeah.
aircraft is a problem. You've got something locked up, and then 2 weeks before Christmas, owner decides that they want the plane instead, and boom, you get the boot. So I think like the overall customer experience in 135, there are some really good companies that do it right, and I think there's a lot of good brokers that can help buffer the direct customer from that experience. But that's kind of been the history of our industry, and I think everyone needs to do a little bit better job on the customer service side to deliver the same experience that people are getting from the more expensive fractional experience.
Yeah, it's true. And, there's something to be said about standardization too, right? Because, you look at the big two, right? Like NetJets and FlexJet, right? The fleet is pretty much the same and consistent across the board, right? The level of service is consistent across the board because it's a culture thing. It's a culture problem within those 135 organizations to start with. And if you have a sales and service culture that is, you're pushing for excellence,
Mhm.
then you're really raising the bar and you're allowing yourself to be in the market where you're significantly more competitive. And those operators we've seen do incredibly well.
Mhm.
So I guess I don't know what I'm saying. I get 35, our equivalent operator out there. It's time to dig deep, look back at your company culture, look at your level of service, look at your, become a more sales oriented culture, and
Yeah.
you will start to see the benefits immediately.
So you are Canadian, if people have not figured that out by now, with the kilogram conversions and everything else.
Well,
So
this
there's some
sort
interest.
of gives it away too.
Yeah, yeah, just a bit. Maybe you just really like hockey. I don't know. In Canada, you guys are facing a shutdown of your biggest air carrier in the nation. There's crew members in Canada are looking basically for pay parity, at least from what I understand, with their American counterparts. Obviously, we've seen some huge increases in U.S. salaries. I don't know, but you probably have more insight on this than I do at this point. So, what are you guys hearing?
Well, it's basically what, the Delta pilots experienced last year for the US, right? I mean, they came back and they said, hey, we want, I think it was something on the order of 45% wage increase across the board. And they got it,
Yeah.
right? And so the Canadians were sort of looking down and going, like, you know what? We should probably ask for the same thing. And lo and behold, here you go, right? If you take a step back and you look at it, geography is a totally different scenario. The restrictions from a regulatory standpoint completely different, right? That's the key difference. And sometimes we ought to be happy with what we have here in Canada because we're not experiencing necessarily the same severe, I'll use the term severe pilot shortage as the US is having. So I think that they're looking down south and they're saying, hey, why do I have to move to Atlanta, Georgia to be able to get, the same salary? But they're not comparing apples to apples. And I think that's the problem here. But nevertheless,
Yeah.
fun fact about Canada is we basically have 3 airlines. We have WestJet, we have Air Canada, and then we have, I think on the list, it's fair to put Porter Airlines,
Oh,
run by
yeah.
Robert DeLewis and his company. Porter is still more of like I guess you could qualify them as like a regional airline. Air Canada still, bar none, it's the largest operator, 705 out here, that
Yeah.
equivalent to 121 that we have. And so, if you want to go from, Montreal to Moose Jaw, guess what? You're not flying WestJet or Porter. You're flying
Right.
Air Canada, right?
Yeah.
And so they do definitely have that monopolistic character. And so the government is going to support them, regardless of what happens. So, as always in Canada, the poor taxpayer pays the burden of everything. But, what I found really interesting about this was looking at the comparison of the Delta pilots and what's happening in the US, because I found a little article that I think I shared with you too.
Yes.
If you want to talk about, let's talk about it, Jesse. Let's talk about the
Oh
$1,500
yeah. I mean,
rule.
look, that's always on everybody's mind where we're talking about the crew shortage. And I like it didn't even dawn on me, but when you said it to me, I was like, right. Like there is such a massive difference in requirements. I mean, because of the Colgan crash in 2009, we got the 1,500-hour rule, which doesn't exist in Canada. Takes a whole new spin on this. So technically, I mean, if you're talking about first officers at least that are lower time, there's definitely a huge experience gap, like just minimum coming into the cockpit. So it does play a role in, I think, compensation.
100%. I mean, if you think about it, track it timeline wise, right? Colgan Air, that was the Buffalo Q400, right? That crashed. Both pilots, right? PIC and right seat were way beyond 1,500 hours, right? So that wasn't an issue. It's not like it's not like they didn't have the time in air. It's just they use this as a way to say, okay, well, we're just going to create this 1,500-hour rule restriction. And obviously, the airline pilots, what is it, the association, I believe what it's called.
Alpha.
I think
Yeah.
we have the equivalent. Yeah, we actually have an equivalent ALPA out here.
Mhm.
And that's the beginning of when this, I guess you could call it, I'm going to use the term manufactured pilot shortage happened.
From the
And
article. From the article.
right, right. And to only exacerbate the fact that, COVID hits and, there's this sudden drop of crew members and, they're probably switching careers, they're moving out of
Yeah.
the space. So all that to say that cumulated to an effect of, okay, now we have significantly less crew supply and therefore guess what happens? Well, wages go up, right? And the companies have
Right.
to pay for it. So in Canada, though, we didn't have the 1,500-hour rule. In Canada, you have to have, I believe, 750 hours to write the ATPL exam, which will
Mhm.
effectively allow you to fly for an airline. So, I mean, the bar is lower. Maybe that's part of the reason why, we can't compare apples to apples here.
Right.
And there's other obvious, geographic and socioeconomic concerns. But I think it's fair to point to that as being the main driver.
Yeah. No, I mean it's a bigger pipeline in general. I did meet the Colgan family, or one of the victims' families last year. That I was at an air safety event, and just to play devil's advocate on their behalf, they'll also tell you that, well, since the 1,500-hour rule, look at the improvements that we've had in safety, and like you can't argue, a more experienced flight crew is going to obviously result in better outcomes from a safety perspective. But at the same time, I think we're entering a point, and now you start to see it as people are going out of business. Volato, some others, they're in serious crunches right now. Costs are exorbitantly high, even for airlines. There is a point at which this doesn't work anymore, and how many people have to go out of business, how many people can't afford pilots or hiring. Like it's going to come to a head, and if not this, it'll be single pilot autonomous co-crewed aircraft or something, but like something does have to give eventually. And when you have such a constrained pilot pool, it just doesn't work.
Well, you know what? It's going to happen sooner if we stop spending our time and money in fully electric aircraft and we spend more time in trying to figure out the single pilot airplane or, more of an autonomous aircraft. I mean, there's very basic technology that can be utilized in the cockpit that,
Yeah.
we're already utilizing some of it today. Really, I mean, a pilot's job has significantly changed. I would argue a pilot is more of a systems administrator now than they are really flying the plane. Take that one step further. We haven't been able to because we've been distracted with other technologies that are coming into play. But
Right.
if we really just toe the line on that, I think that we can make significant differences as to, crew requirements and how many people actually need to train to become pilots per se, right? Let's let's say the equivalent of a pilot is a doctor, maybe a first officer is like a registered nurse, right? We need more registered nurses, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's it, I think it's coming down to that, and it doesn't mean that either one is less competent or anything like that. It's really just, the burden of training is incredibly expensive, and
Yeah.
to be able to put all that up and risk losing that person, it's incredibly costly with a industry that's already high fixed costs, high
Yeah.
barriers to entry. It's an economic nightmare.
Well, and we've seen pilot unions already starting to fight, the autonomous concepts. But from a safety perspective, they do need to think about how important that technology and the development of that technology is going to be for safety. If not replacing them in the cockpit, augmenting their skill set. Visual cues, information. The things that we'll learn from trying to create autonomous flight will also have massive impacts on how they fly airplanes in the future. So I get it. I understand not wanting to be replaced by technology, but we all can't be the John Henrys out there trying to build our railroad.
It's probably a terrible analogy, but I think that my driving has improved partially because I've gotten older, but also because of the technological innovation that's happening
Of
on the
course.
automotive world. And one of the things that I think about is I've never had my car stop for me before when it notices some, car in front of me that's probably in a line of traffic that's stopping. First time in my life, car sort of tapped the brakes and I was like, oh, I should be paying attention.
Mhm.
Dumb little human over here didn't figure it
Right.
out, but the car figured it out before me. And so we've embraced that for drivers, which, driving arguably has incredibly more risks, right? It's incredibly more risky to drive yourself from one place to another and take an airplane. And so why haven't we embraced, similar technology in aviation, right? I think there's the union factor. I think there's also the social view of I want to see two people at the front in the cockpit,
Mm-hmm.
and which is a bit of a barrier too. But again, lots of work to do to change some of that perception. And we don't do a good job in this industry of comparing flight to as a means of transportation.
Mm.
It's still highly romanticized,
Yeah.
right? And so if we really just start to think about, flying is effectively a mode of transportation, similar to driving, similar to taking a train, you start to break down those barriers. And that's something that's again tough to do, but we should be spending our time and energy there for sure.
Yeah. But don't worry. I don't think anytime soon you're going to be losing your two pilots in the cockpit. Some operations one, but I think you should always have two, by the way. But, with that, considering how much airlines have slowed down the hiring and the layoffs that we're seeing, I think at least for the time being, there's a lot less pressure on some business aviation operations with their crew members right now. So enjoy it while it lasts and go and scoop up some talent out there. Okay, so I'm really excited about this, Shaan. And I don't really get excited about, newfangled electric flying things usually, but this one I think is really cool. So the US Coast Guard, not the FAA, has recently allowed Regent Viceroy Sea Glider to start to conduct testing, essentially. They plan to start service in 2025, probably a bit ambitious. But the really cool thing about this is because it is hovering over the ground or over the sea at 30 feet, it's technically still a boat. So the US Coast Guard will be in charge of certifying the craft, not the FAA, even though it's kind of a plane. I just think that's a really cool concept.
How is it floating? So it's like a hoverboard?
Basically, and this is not new technology. This is something like the Russians were doing many, many years ago. They even have like Navy
Right.
aircraft that do this. But it's a wing and ground effect. I believe they start out like with a hydrofoil, then eventually just the air
Mm-hmm.
against the sea is what's keeping the thing afloat. But they're planning on it being fully electric. It's supposed to go 150 knots. Right now, with current battery technology, they think they can get about 160 nautical miles out of it. With future battery technology, they're hoping for 500. So they're going to start to try to compete with, these small commuter airlines that are up there in New England and other places ferry hopping. Do you believe, Shaan? Is it possible?
Whenever you ask me if you believe in something that's fully electric, you unleash the rant in me. And again, not politically, not that I don't think it's clean, purely from a physics and draw your control volume around how efficient is this really? And I could probably dispel those myths, but it's so cool, right? There's no doubt about it. It's really cool. So it makes me think of this company that's based out of BC in Canada on the west called Harbor Air. And what they do is they have seaplanes. They're effectively little single engine piston airplanes that are doing hops between the islands out there, and they run on floats. And this is an alternative to taking the ferries.
Right.
Now, is there appetite for having a really cool 12 packs hoverboard just whooshing across at 150 knots? It's effectively the same speed, right? So I think it comes down to what are the economics of it, right?
Yeah.
Does it make sense? 12 packs is way better than what Harbor Air is carrying right now, right? In their little airplanes. So there's something interesting there. I just can't fathom it being. I can see it being cost punitive, significantly cost punitive.
Yeah, we'll have to see how they end up with the numbers. But I mean, I will say, I spent quite a lot of time in Rhode Island this summer. We did Newport and all those areas over there. There's a huge ferry business. I mean, they've got 500 passenger ferries going back and forth to Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, Shelter Island. There is a lot of need there. And even, commuters from Boston going over to those locations too. And I'll be honest, going 160 miles over water sounds pretty cool to me, even if it's
Right. And then,
more
what's
expensive.
great about it, the other big thing that's great about it is you're not subject to weather, right? Because, I mean, well, you're flying in the weather, but, you're not in the clouds, right? You don't have to worry about any of that. You don't have to worry about icing, right? All those things sort of fall away. And so
Yeah.
it does definitely make sense, right? We're not talking about aviation here. We're talking about a boat, effectively. That's, I guess, a couple feet off the sea line.
Yeah. I mean, the other alternative to that is that you also can't always see what's in the sea. So if you come up on a log or a buoy or
Well,
debris, a
you would
small
hope that
craft,
you'd hope the radar technology is sort of in play there, and it's going to figure that out for you.
hopefully. Can you imagine? Can you imagine being a little sailboat? You're just enjoying your day and you're accidentally in the ferry lane one day and this flying ship goes past you at 160.
That would definitely happen. I just feel like that's something that would happen, and it would be in the news, and they're like, "Oh, no more hovercraft for everybody." Right?
But I think it's
It's like,
awesome,
oh,
and I hope they're successful. And I would really like to be a customer one day.
I think that's really cool. I would like it so much more if it was hybrid technology and it wasn't fully electric, and if it was also an eVTOL craft. So if it did hit a land border, it could just, no problem, vertical lift, and off we go to where we need to go.
Pretty cool. Pretty cool stuff. I do like that they're actually considering existing battery technology and they're not promising some crazy lift ratio with future technology. They do seem to be approaching this from a more realistic standpoint, if you can call a flying boat a realistic
Well,
idea.
I'm sure the Coast Guard can.
Go Coast Guard. I love this. I'm hoping they may are they gonna be more stringent or less stringent? Do they involve the FAA at any decision making point? Or I wonder how that all works.
Probably not. That'll just slow everything down, right?
And with that, we will wrap up this pod today. Thank you for joining us. The VIP seat is the fastest way to get the top news in private aviation. Don't forget to subscribe to our weekly email digest and make sure that you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Comments and suggestions on what we should cover next are always welcome, so stay in touch, and we'll see you next time on the VIP seat.